The Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and it continued until 1945, becoming the most destructive global conflict in human history. Yet this war was not merely the sum of battles won or lost on the front lines. It was also the historical outcome of miscalculations, ideological blindness, and unchecked ambition. Behind the war stood the unjust international order established after the First World War, the heavy burdens imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, the economic collapse caused by the Great Depression of 1929, and the aggressive expansionist policies of totalitarian regimes rising across Europe and Asia. These conditions created deep resentment, a sense of humiliation, and a powerful desire for revenge within German society, emotions that Adolf Hitler skillfully exploited on his path to power. However, Hitler's rise also marked the beginning of Germany's inevitable collapse. Under Adolf Hitler's leadership, Nazi Germany rapidly rearmed and turned toward Central and Eastern Europe in line with its living space policy. This expansionist strategy initially brought significant military success. Following the invasion of Poland, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. Yet, despite this, Germany stunned the world with its blitzkrieg tactics. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France were defeated in quick succession, reinforcing Hitler's confidence and spreading the belief, both inside Germany and abroad, that the German army was invincible. These early victories, however, fed Hitler's greatest illusion: the confusion of temporary superiority with lasting power. With France's surrender in 1940, most of continental Europe fell under Nazi control. But Britain's refusal to capitulate left Germany facing a resilient and unresolved enemy. Hitler believed that Britain could be forced into submission through air attacks alone. Yet his failure to achieve complete air superiority marked one of the first major strategic failures of the war. By 1941, Hitler's mistakes had reached an irreversible scale. Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union represented a moment when ideological obsession overtook military logic. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet state could be crushed quickly, severely underestimating both the vastness of its territory and the depth of its human resources. The Eastern Front became not just a battlefield, but a massive economic and logistical drain for Germany. Harsh winter conditions, overstretched supply lines, and relentless Soviet resistance gradually wore down the German army, while battles such as Stalingrad resulted in losses that could never be fully recovered. From this point on, Germany was increasingly forced onto the defensive, and the initiative of the war slowly slipped from Hitler's grasp. That same year, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, further deepening Hitler's strategic crisis. Germany now faced not only the European powers, but also the world's greatest industrial force. With the United States entering the conflict, the war became truly global, and the balance of production and resources rapidly shifted against Germany. At this stage, Hitler transformed the war from a military struggle into an ideological battle for survival, issuing increasingly detached and rigid decisions while refusing to accept that time itself was working against him. What has been described so far is only the beginning of understanding why Hitler lost the war. The true collapse did not occur solely on the battlefields, but in the moment when Hitler became trapped within the very system and worldview he had created. One of the most critical reasons Adolf Hitler lost the war was his gradual and complete detachment from military reality, coupled with his systematic dismantling of Germany's professional command structure. In the early years of the war, Hitler allowed his generals a degree of operational freedom. But as victories accumulated, he began to view himself as a military genius. Strategic decision-making increasingly shifted into his own hands, stripping the German army of one of its greatest strengths: flexibility. Field commanders, even when withdrawal was clearly necessary, were bound by Hitler's rigid, stand-fast orders, leading entire armies to be encircled and destroyed. Stalingrad stands as the clearest example of this catastrophic leadership failure. What could have been a controlled retreat and partial preservation of forces instead became a total disaster, costing Germany hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed or captured. This defeat shattered not only Germany's military capacity, but also the myth of invincibility that had sustained the Nazi war effort. Another fatal miscalculation was Hitler's belief that a two-front war could be sustained indefinitely. While Germany was locked in a brutal war of attrition against the Soviet Union in the east, it continued to face Britain in the west, a situation that grew far more dangerous after the United States entered the conflict. Germany's industrial base simply could not support such an expansive and prolonged struggle. In contrast, the Allies deliberately transformed the war into a long-term contest of endurance, one that overwhelmingly favored their superior economic and demographic resources. Hitler, however, remained fixated on the pursuit of rapid, decisive victories and refused to acknowledge that time was his enemy. As the war dragged on, Germany suffered from critical shortages of fuel, ammunition, and trained manpower, while Allied strength increased with each passing month. The loss of air superiority marked another turning point in Germany's defeat. Germany's failure to neutralize Britain's air defenses, followed by the massive strategic bombing campaigns conducted by the United States and the United Kingdom, left German cities in ruins. Industrial centers, rail networks, and energy infrastructure were systematically targeted, crippling the German war economy. These air raids also devastated civilian morale, exposing the growing gap between Nazi propaganda and lived reality. Yet instead of adapting to these conditions, Hitler responded with denial and increasingly radical rhetoric, further disconnecting his leadership from the realities on the ground. Nazi ideology itself played a decisive role in Germany's downfall. The regime's rigid, racist worldview prevented cooperation with local populations in occupied territories, and instead fueled resentment and resistance. Across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union, German forces turned potential allies into determined enemies. Even more damaging were the genocidal policies directed against Jews, Roma, the disabled, and other targeted groups. These crimes were not only moral atrocities, but also strategic self-sabotage. Resources, transportation networks, and manpower that could have supported the war effort were diverted toward mass murder. Trains carried civilians to extermination camps instead of soldiers and supplies to the front, quietly undermining Germany's already strained logistics. The Allied landing in Normandy in 1944 finally shattered what remained of Hitler's strategic vision. With Allied forces advancing from the west and the Red Army pushing relentlessly from the east, Germany was now trapped in a war it could neither win nor escape. The conflict had become purely defensive, Yet Germany lacked the military strength and economic capacity to sustain such a defense. Even as the situation collapsed, Hitler rejected the possibility of surrender, clinging instead to imaginary counteroffensives and unrealistic hopes. This refusal to confront reality prolonged the war and magnified the destruction inflicted upon Germany itself. To understand why Adolf Hitler ultimately lost the Second World War, it is necessary to ask a deeper question. When was Germany truly defeated? Militarily, the defeat came in 1945 with the fall of Berlin, but strategically and psychologically, the war was lost much earlier. The moment Hitler believed he had already won was, paradoxically, the moment he began to lose. The rapid collapse of Poland, France, and much of Western Europe destroyed his ability to assess reality. What followed was a transformation of the war from a rational struggle for power into a reckless gamble shaped by ideological obsession. Germany's territorial ambitions far exceeded the limits of its economy, its military capacity, and the endurance of its population. Hitler failed to grasp a fundamental principle of warfare. Wars are not won by attack alone, but by sustainability. At the core of Hitler's defeat was his belief that sheer willpower could override material reality. In his worldview, determination, absolute obedience, and refusal to retreat could bend history itself. Modern warfare, however, is governed not by ideology, but by economics, logistics, technology, and time. The invasion of the Soviet Union was the ultimate denial of this reality. Vast distances, brutal winters, and seemingly endless reserves of manpower turned Germany's dream of a quick victory into a prolonged nightmare. Meanwhile, in the West, the growing strength of the Allies, especially the industrial might of the United States, transformed the conflict into a war of attrition that Germany was structurally incapable of winning. Rather than adapting to these conditions, Hitler dismissed every setback as temporary and every warning as defeatism, pushing his regime deeper into irreversible decline. Nazi ideology was not merely a moral catastrophe, it was a strategic one. Its racist and exclusionary logic deprived Germany of potential allies and ensured constant resistance in occupied territories. The systematic extermination of millions was not only a crime against humanity, but also a massive diversion of resources at a time when Germany could least afford it. Trains, fuel, personnel, and administrative energy were consumed by genocide rather than directed toward the war effort. In this sense, the Nazi state was fighting two wars at once, one against its external enemies and another against its own capacity to survive. By the final stages of the war, the gap between Hitler's imagined reality and the actual state of the battlefield had become absolute. From his bunker in Berlin, he issued orders to divisions that no longer existed and planned counterattacks that could never be launched. His refusal to accept defeat ensured that the destruction of Germany would be total rather than limited. Hitler's suicide marked not just the end of a regime, but the collapse of an ideology that had claimed absolute power over truth and reality itself. In the end, Adolf Hitler did not lose the war because of a single decision or one fatal mistake. He lost because of a worldview built on illusion, excess ambition, and ideological fanaticism. His defeat stands as one of history's clearest warnings. When power divorces itself from reality, it inevitably consumes both its enemies and its creator.